On September 9th, 2025, a panel of judges at the International Criminal Court opened a hearing against a man who was not in the room. He had never been in the room. For 20 years, since the court issued the first arrest warrants in its history back in 2005, no government, no army, and no manhunt had managed to get Joseph Kony in front of a judge. He had outlived 4 out of the 5 commanders indicted alongside him. He had outlasted a 6-year military operation backed by the United States, and he had outlasted the most watched advocacy video ever made, a film that told the entire world he would be under arrest by the end of 2012. So the court did something it had never done before. It heard the case anyway. 2 months later, in November 2025, it confirmed all 39 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity against him, with the defendant's chair empty. This was the first time the ICC had ever sent a case toward trial without the accused present. A quiet acknowledgement that by 2025, nobody really expected him to show up. This is the story about that empty chair. It's a story about how a war that ran for 2 decades got compressed into 30 minutes, watched 100 million times in under a week, and then more or less forgotten inside of a month. It's about a charity, a bracelet, 100 American soldiers, and a man who sat his 5-year-old son down to explain that he hunted bad guys for a living. But to understand why that chair is empty, you have to go back to before there was a warlord to put in it. You have to go back to a country that was assembled, more or less on purpose, to come apart. Uganda as a country is a British invention. There's no insult in that. Most modern borders are. But the way it was drawn matters, because the fault lines that Joseph Kony would later walk through were administrative, drawn for the convenience of governing. When the British consolidated the territory in the late 1800s, they took a patchwork of kingdoms and peoples who had no particular reason to share a government and put them under one. Then they sorted them. The south, especially the kingdom of Uganda, got the schools, the cash crops, the civil service. The north, including the Acholi people, got a narrower assignment. The north supplied soldiers and laborers. The British also imported roughly 32,000 South Asians to run the railways and the commercial economy, which produced a 3-tier hierarchy: British on top, South Asians in the middle, and the African majority at the bottom. None of this is exotic. It's the standard colonial recipe. You govern a place more easily when the people inside it are organized into ranks that resent one another. Independence came in 1962. The first Prime Minister, Milton Obote, spent a few years dismantling the democratic scaffolding, suspended the constitution, abolishing the old kingdoms, and exiling rivals. And in January 1971, while Obote was out of the country at a Commonwealth summit in Singapore, his army chief seized the government. That was Idi Amin. Amin ran Uganda for 8 years and killed somewhere on the order of 300,000 people. He expelled the country's South Asian population in 1972, somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people, many of them holding British passports, and the economy that they had largely run collapsed behind them. Amin was finally driven out in 1979 in a war with Tanzania. He died in exile in Saudi Arabia in 2003, never tried for anything. Obote came back. Then, in 1986, after years of civil war, a guerrilla commander named Yoweri Museveni took power. He is still in power today, almost 40 years later. hold on to that because it matters. Every rebellion in the story is a rebellion against the same man. And when Museveni won, the Acholi North found itself on the losing side. The soldiers the British had spent a century cultivating were now associated with the regimes that had just been overthrown. The North was poor, it was armed, and it was afraid of what the new government would do to it. That fear was the soil. The next thing to grow in it came wrapped in prophecy. In 1986, a woman named Alice Auma announced that she had been possessed by a spirit. The spirit was called Lakwena, messenger, in the Acholi language, and it had instructed her to raise an army and cleanse Uganda. She took the name Alice Lakwena, and the movement she built was called the Holy Spirit Movement. Her military doctrine was, to put it gently, unconventional. She told her fighters that if they anointed themselves with shea oil, bullets would pass through them. She told them not to take cover. For a while, and this is the part that's easy to laugh at and shouldn't be, it worked well enough that she won real battles and marched toward the capital. In 1987, government troops cut her movement apart on the approach to Kampala. Lakwena fled to a refugee camp in Kenya where she lived out the rest of her life. She died there in 2007. But her movement did not die with her. A young man stepped into the vacuum and gathered up the survivors. By his own account, he was Lakwena's cousin, though there's good reason to think he invented that connection to inherit her followers, and Lakwena herself always kept her distance from him. His name was Joseph Kony. He had been an altar boy, and he claimed, like she had, to speak for spirits. We actually know a fair amount about Kony's spiritual system because years later one of his own men testified about it in open court. Kony said he was possessed by many spirits, each with a name, a personality, and a job. There was a chairman spirit named Juma Oris. There was a Sudanese spirit, Silindi, in charge of operations. There was an American spirit, Jim Bricky, who are you, in charge of intelligence. There was one called Ing Chu, and when the spirits spoke through Kony, he was said to go unconscious, and the movement employed a designated clerk whose only job was to write down the minutes so Kony would know what he had said when he came back to himself. Kony's stated goal was to overthrow Museveni and rule Uganda according to the 10 Commandments. What he actually built was a machine for abducting children. The Acholi people, the very people Kony claimed to be fighting for, grew tired of him, and when his own community stopped working in support of him, he started raiding it. He took its children. The standard estimate for the most careful survey work done after the war is that as many as 66,000 young people were abducted across the entire conflict. Most were taken briefly for days or weeks and forced to carry loads, and roughly 80% eventually escaped or were released or rescued. But a smaller core population were kept, broken, and turned into soldiers and so-called wives. The figure you'll hear most often is 30,000 children. That number is real, but it's a total accumulated over 20 years, not, as it's often implied, a standing army. Why children? Because a child who's been forced to kill, sometimes to kill their own family, has nowhere left to go. You severed them from the world that would take them back. In 1994, the rebellion got a lifeline. A government of Sudan began backing Kony, mostly to spite Museveni, who was backing rebels inside Sudan. That support is a large part of why the LRA survived as long as it did. By the early 2000s, the war had a shape that anyone in northern Uganda could describe to you. Children would walk every evening from villages across the north, and they would leave their home and walk into the larger towns, especially Gulu, to sleep in bus parks and church verandas and hospital grounds, anywhere with enough people that the LRA wouldn't raid it. They were called the Night Commuters. In the daytime, they walked home. Meanwhile, the government's answer was to herd close to 2 million people into displacement camps. Camps where, by some measures, more people died of disease and squalor than the war itself was killing. There were massacres with names the campaign would never mention. Atiak in 1995, where around 300 people were killed. In 2005, the ICC unsealed its first arrest warrants ever. 5 LRA commanders, Kony at the very top, charged with crimes against humanity and war crimes. Kony's warrant listed 33 counts. And here is the timing that the whole later story turns on. By the time those arrest warrants were public, the war in Uganda was already ending. Peace talks were happening in 2006, and Kony used these talks to regroup, as he always had, at one point executing his own deputy, Vincent Oti, during the negotiations, and then he slipped across the borders into Congo, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan. A botched joint offensive at the end of 2008 scattered him further and triggered a wave of retaliatory Christmas massacres in Congo, but it did not bring him back. So by 2006, Joseph Kony was gone from Uganda. Northern Uganda began to slowly rebuild. The night commutes would stop and the camps would empty. The war that the world was about to hear of in Uganda was already over. In 2003, 3 young men from Southern California flew to Africa to make a movie. Jason Russell, Bobby Bailey, and Lauren Poole were all in their early 20s and wanted to film a war. They set out for Sudan, but did not make it. Fighting pushed them back across the border into northern Uganda, into Gulu. And there they found the night commuters, thousands of children walking into town to sleep. Russell, who had grown up in Christian youth theater and wanted to make musicals, found his subject instead. He met a boy named Jacob Akai, who had been abducted, who had watched the LRA kill his brother, and who told Russell on camera that he sometimes wished he were dead. That footage became a documentary called Invisible Children, and the documentary became an organization with the same name. And the organization figured out something that most charities never do: how to reach the youth. Their method was relentless and a little strange. They sent teams of roadies, mostly young Americans, each team paired with a Ugandan who had lived the war, touring high schools and colleges, screening the films, selling merchandise, signing up the next wave. Recruits fundraised their way in. They would hit quotas, and they were rewarded with parties. Critics would notice the structure looked a bit like a pyramid. Defenders pointed out that nobody was getting a cut, that this was just very effective youth organizing. Both things were true. And it scaled. In 2006, Invisible Children staged the global night commute, Around 80,000 young people across 125 American cities walking into their own downtowns and sleeping there, in solidarity with kids on the other side of the planet. The message behind this is beautiful. It's young people gathering because they hear of an atrocity in the world, and there's not really much that you can do as an individual to express your disdain, distaste, dissatisfaction with the state of the world. And I think that this sort of thing it's a beautiful thing, and it's not really something that you would see in the world today. And I think that there's a sort of innocence in this whole subject of Kony 2012. I remember watching this video when I was, just getting out of high school, and I'm like, yeah, we gotta stop that guy. We gotta wake up and put these posters up and wear these bracelets and get this guy. And the way that the internet has jaded us across the couple decades that it's been really expanding, nothing like this can really, I can't see something like this ever happening again. In 2009 came the rescue. 85,000 people, 100 cities, 10 countries, participants abducting themselves and waiting to be symbolically rescued by a celebrity. It was earnest and a little absurd, and it landed in the exact cultural moment that would reward it. This was the dawn of Facebook's newsfeed, of Twitter, of the belief, sincerely held, that being connected was the same thing as being powerful. One former staffer called it the techno-optimism era. They meant it as a good thing. The organizing reached Washington too. Supporters lobbied Congress, and in 2010, President Obama signed the LRA Disarmament and Northern Uganda Recovery Act. And in October 2011, he sent about 100 American Special Forces advisors to Central Africa to help regional armies track Kony down. It's worth pausing on a criticism that was true even then. Some of the regional armies the United States was now arming and assisting had their own records of using child soldiers and abusing civilians, the Ugandan military included. The good guys and bad guys frame was already cracking before the famous video was ever made. Because here's what people forget. Kony 2012 was not a fluke. It was not 3 guys getting lucky. It was the payoff of 8 years of groundwork, an audience already built, a machine already running, a network of kids primed to share the next thing the moment that it dropped. All invisible children needed was a reason to believe the moment had come. They found that moment on May 2011 when American forces killed Osama bin Laden, and the entire internet metabolized it overnight. Jokes, memes, tributes, all of it instant and global. One of Invisible Children's policy people said something that became the whole strategy. He said, roughly, "I just wish Kony were that famous. We spend all our time first telling people who he is before we can ever get them to act." So the goal was set: make Kony famous. Then make him infamous. Then watch the world do the rest. Kony 2012 went online on March 5th, 2012. It's 29 minutes and 58 seconds long, and that length was deliberate. The team had studied what made videos travel. It opens not with Kony, but with Jason Russell's newborn son, Gavin. Russell narrates his own life, his own promise, and his own child. He introduces Jacob, the boy from 2003, as our friend in Africa. And in the film's most quoted moment, he frames the whole enterprise as a question to the viewer. Who are you to end a war? And then, who are you not to? The strategy was laid out plainly. target 20 celebrities and 12 policymakers, flood them, make the man's name unavoidable, buy a $30 action kit with a bracelet and a stack of posters, and on one night, April 20th, cover every city in the world with his face. Now I remember watching this video. It was hype. Everybody was sharing this. You could not avoid it. You would watch it, and if you had a heart, you'd be like, I gotta do something. I have to paint tonight. I'm pretty sure that was the slogan. It was with some I can't stop. It was super well edited. Really grabbed you. Really knew what it was doing. And it worked beyond anything its makers had imagined. They had hoped for 500,000 views in a year. They got that in a few hours. In about 6 days, the campaign cleared 100 million views. The fastest anything has ever spread on the internet to that point. Faster than Susan Boyle, faster than Lady Gaga, anything. Now, that headline number deserves an asterisk because it counted the original plus hundreds of response videos, and it was not pure word of mouth. It was launched into orbit by Oprah, Rihanna, Justin Bieber, Kim Kardashian, all sharing it to tens of millions of followers at once. But the scale was real. Over 3 million people signed that pledge. The hashtag was retweeted more than 2 million times in a single month. The celebrities weren't only being asked to tweet either. The ICC's chief prosecutor at the time, Luis Moreno Ocampo, the man who appears in the video itself calling for Kony's arrest, had ideas of his own, and we know this because his emails leaked years later. He had floated the idea of using Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt to lure Kony to a dinner where he could be quietly arrested. He'd also approached George Clooney about borrowing satellite imagery and Sean Penn about a meeting in South Sudan. None of this went anywhere. These were just ideas in an inbox, never a plan. But it tells you something about the altitude this case had reached. The world's chief war crimes prosecutor was, on some level, trying to resolve the matter with star power. And the money came behind it. Across 2012, Invisible Children took in roughly $26 million for a charity that had rarely cracked 10. By its own account, the campaign's net proceeds were about $12.5 million. They moved hundreds of thousands of action kits and close to 1 million bracelets. If you have one of these, please send it to me. This is where the first cracks begin to show up. The Prime Minister of Uganda, Amama Mbabazi, recorded a response pointing out the obvious. The video spoke as if Kony were still in Uganda, as if the war were still raging, and neither were true. Kony had been gone for 6 years. The LRA had dwindled to a fraction of its former size. A Ugandan journalist, Rosebel Kagmar, put the deeper objection on camera that this was once again an outsider arriving to be the hero of an African story, and that the people best placed to solve northern Uganda's problems were the people who live there. The writer, Tiju Cole, gave the critique its sharpest line about the kind of Westerner who supports brutal policies in the morning and founds charities in the afternoon. Then came the money questions, and this is where I want to be careful because the popular version gets it wrong in an interesting way. Critics said only about a third of Invisible Children's budget, roughly 37%, actually reached programs on the ground in Central Africa. Invisible Children said the figure was over 80%. Both numbers were accurate. The difference was definitional. Invisible Children counted its American awareness and advocacy work, the films, tours, the lobbying, as program spending, because awareness was its stated mission. Their own policy director said it cleanly. They were not an aid organization. They never claimed to be. The charity watchdogs flagged a different problem: governance and transparency. Too few independent board members, years of ignored letters from the Better Business Bureau. The picture that emerged was blurrier and more honest than fraud. An organization that was very good at attention and had told the world that attention was the point. And it was all landing on one man, Jason Russell. Did 17 interviews in 48 hours. He stopped sleeping. The film was personal. It had his son in it. So the attacks were personal too. On March 15th, 10 days after the launch, Russell was found on a street corner in the Pacific Beach neighborhood of San Diego, undressed, pounding at the pavement, ranting. Police did not arrest him. They took him to a hospital, and they were clear that he was not on drugs. They said that if he had been, they would have taken him to jail instead. The preliminary diagnosis was brief reactive psychosis, a short, total break brought on by extreme stress, sleeplessness, and dehydration, the kind from which people usually recover fully. Someone filmed it on a phone and sold it to TMZ, and within minutes, the man who had set out to make a warlord famous was the famous one, naked on the internet for the world to share. The campaign had done exactly what it promised. It had made a name travel further and faster than any name had traveled before. The trouble was that the thing it had made legible, one villain, one solution, one click, was not the thing that was true. Jacob Akaye, the boy from the film, by now a young man, defended it. He testified before the U.S. Senate in April 2012 and told reporters the criticism was unfair, that without the attention the film brought, he wouldn't have the life that he now had. He had a point too. That's the difficult thing about this story. Almost everyone in it was telling a version of the truth, at least within their own frame. The campaign had a finale built in. April 20th, 2012. Cover the night. That's what it was. Cover the night. Whoever made this thing really knows how to write a script. Anyway, the plan was that the world would go to sleep and wake up to Kony's face on every wall in every city. The world woke up to mostly empty streets. The numbers tell it plainly enough. Gatherings that had thousands of online RSVPs, which I remember I signed up for, drew dozens of actual people, sometimes fewer. Yeah, I didn't go. The energy that had moved 100 million views in a week could not move a few thousand teenagers out of their front doors. Invisible Children had already released a follow-up, Kony 2012 Part 2, this time not narrated by Russell, but by the CEO. It tried to answer the critics, but almost nobody watched that, including me. What followed was a long, slow exhale. Invisible Children cut its staff roughly in half. By the organization's own admission, the tens of millions raised by the campaign were largely spent within 18 to 24 months. In 2014 and 2015, the group announced it was winding down its US operations and handing its work to local partners. The machine that had been 8 years in the making came apart in about 2. But the deployment didn't end with a hashtag. The American advisors and the regional armies kept hunting for Kony for years after the internet stopped paying attention. The operation ran until the spring of 2017, and then in April of that year, the United States and Uganda announced they were winding it down. Not because they had caught him, but because they said the LRA had been neutralized, and no longer posed a meaningful threat. 4 of the 5 commanders the ICC had indicted were dead or captured. Only Kony was still free. The man the entire operation was named for walked away from it. Even Invisible Children's own people called the withdrawal premature. The LRA today is a husk. By one count, around 70 fighters scattered across the borderlands, surviving on poaching and trafficking. Its splinter groups breaking off. Even 2 of Kony's own sons abandoning him. And then there's Dominic Ongwen, because his case is the one that should sit with you. Ongwen was one of the 5 commanders indicted in 2005. He was also, when he was about 9 years old, a child in the LRA abducted on his way to school. He was made into exactly the kind of soldier this entire campaign was built to rescue. He rose through the ranks. He committed atrocities. He surrendered in 2015, and in 2021, the ICC convicted him on 61 counts and sentenced him to 25 years, which he is now serving in Norway. The court had to weigh his crimes against his own stolen childhood, and it convicted him anyway. The one person the world's first permanent war crimes court has put away over the LRA was himself one of the abducted children. Which brings us back to the empty chair. In 2025, 20 years after the warrant, 13 years after the video, the ICC confirmed all 39 charges against Joseph Kony without him there to hear them, because the alternative was to admit the case would simply never move at all. It's tempting to file Kony 2012 under failure and leave it at that. The video was wrong about where Kony was, the charity spent more on itself than its donors assumed, and the big night was a no-show. Kony was never caught. But I don't think the interesting failure is any of those. The interesting failure is the idea underneath the whole thing. The one that made it the most shared video on Earth in the first place. The campaign sold a theory of how the world works, that if enough people simply knew, the machinery of governments and armies and courts would swing into motion and resolve the thing. That attention was the same as action, that a 20-year war had one face, and that putting that face on a poster was a meaningful step toward ending it. And the strange thing is, the machinery actually did move. Congress passed a law, a president sent soldiers, a court issued warrants. Everything the video asked for, more or less, happened. And it still produced an empty chair, because a war is not a villain, and a region's recovery is not a manhunt, and the things that actually rebuilt northern Uganda, the slow, unglamorous work of peace talks and returning families and people going home, were already underway, off screen, while the world was busy learning the name Kony. The campaign told millions of young people that they were the solution to someone else's catastrophe. The most that can be said is that it made them feel, at least for a few weeks, like history was something you could touch. There's one promise in the film that quietly came true. In the opening, that boy, Jacob, said he wanted to be a lawyer, but there was no money, so it would never happen. The film holds him up as a problem the West has arrived to solve. But by the time the film made him famous, Jacob was already studying law at the Makerere University in Kampala, and he became a lawyer. He did it in the country the video told the world was too broken to fix, and he did it himself. But Joseph Kony is still out there. and that court is still waiting, and that chair is still empty.